Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first Listen and Learn. My name is Scot Loyd, and I expect that Henny will be joining me momentarily. We're so glad that all of you could join us on this inaugural edition of Listen and Learn, and we appreciate all of you being here today. And we're going to be talking about issues of race and reconciliation and what that looks like in our world today. It's very, very important that all of us consider this. So thank you very much, Allie, for joining. Waiting momentarily, eagerly anticipating Allie's arrival. It says adding, connecting, and there you are. Happy Juneteenth.
Thank you. Thank you. Glad to be here.
I really appreciate you agreeing to do this and to spend some time talking about these important issues of race and reconciliation. And Allie, before we get started with our conversation, I wanted to take a moment and sort of let our listeners know why this is of importance to me. As part of my interdisciplinary studies in the philosophy of heritage and the pursuit of my PhD, I have spent a great deal of time, as you have, thinking and reading and reevaluating my own biases when it comes to the issues of race in America. And the emphasis of my particular study is that of my own personal religious heritage, and it's still a major part of my belief system and practice, as well as my life and ministry. And that's an emphasis on Pentecostalism, specifically the rhetoric and the practices of the Azusa Street mission that was led by an African-American preacher, William J. Seymour. Now, Azusa Street, as many people may know, was the impetus for the worldwide revival that still is of great influence today. And sadly so, the revival would be stifled due to the prevailing racism of the day. And this was given a voice, ironically so, by Seymour's teacher and a person that many people consider to be the father of modern day Pentecostalism, Charles Parham. But before the normative white culture suffocated the revival, Azusa Street was a transgressive space where black and white and rich and poor, men and women worshiped together, enjoying the empowerment of the Holy Spirit in these meetings that were led by the Louisiana son of emancipated slaves. And so as I continue to think through these particular issues, obviously I'm limited by my experiences as a middle-aged white guy. And so it's helpful for me to reach out to my friends of color so that I can better understand these issues, especially as they are manifested in our day. And so I'm thankful and I'm blessed with many voices of diversity in my life. And Allie, I've been specifically impressed with what you are doing. So welcome to the program. I know that you and I share specific heritage in the Pentecostal, apostolic, charismatic experience. And I consider you to be a friend. And you've been outspoken on these issues in both your private and public life and ministry. So Allie, welcome. And once again, thank you for agreeing to do this.
Well, thank you for having me on, Scott. I really appreciate it. Really appreciate having this platform to be able to just share about what God is doing and what I think that the Spirit of the Lord is speaking in this hour.
And I want to start a little bit by giving you an opportunity to tell us a little bit about yourself personally, about who you are, about your experiences growing up and maybe some of your experiences now serving in the church. What does your life and ministry and area of study look like?
Well, right now I am a Master of Divinity student at Fuller Theological Seminary. This is my fourth quarter. I just started my fourth quarter yesterday. So this fall I will officially be a second year MDiv candidate. And so that's been really great. Fuller is a good school. we're also kind of fighting this fight a little bit at Fuller. Fuller's a great school. Fuller, they definitely want to center diversity. They definitely want to be an institution that that focuses on diversity. One of the things that they say about Fuller is that they're training global leaders. And so some Black students, including me, are sort of holding Fuller to that standard right now. And so there's been some things going on Fuller campus. And I'm actually an online student. I don't live in Pasadena. I live in Missouri. And so I'm an online student pursuing my studies online. And so that's sort of one little part of my work. But I'm getting my Master of Divinity. And with that, I actually hope to pastor someday. I really hope to pastor a church, to speak, to do different things. And so part of that, in getting my Master of Divinity, the program actually offers where you can have an emphasis. And so my emphasis is on race, cultural identity, and reconciliation. And really what that means as far as an emphasis goes is that I do all of the normal theological training, do all of the leadership. I have to take homiletics, which is where you learn how to preach. I have to do all that type of stuff. But then in addition to that, I also take several units of specialized study in the area of race and cultural identity and reconciliation. And so, for example, one of the classes that I've taken as part of my emphasis is the Theology and Ethics of Martin Luther King Jr. And so that's been something that's been great to have in my pocket with my experience at Fuller. As far as ministry, I've been in ministry since 2003. I actually turned 33 in 2 weeks. July 2nd. I had to think about my birthday. I was trying to think of like how many weeks it was, not that I don't know my birthday. But
it happens. I promise. The older you get.
On July 2nd. And so I have been doing ministry in some capacity almost nearly full time most of the time since 2003. And so the predominant scope of that ministry has been in teen ministry. I've predominantly have ministered to teens. That's where I started out. That's where I've spent the most time, but the Lord has also had me in other places in ministry too. I served as an administrative pastor at a church. Right now for my apprenticeship, because part of my education, I have to do an apprenticeship with a church. And so I'm actually doing an apprenticeship with a church plant, or I'm getting ready to start the process of doing an apprenticeship with a church plant in the city that I live. So I'm really excited about that. And that'll give me some more opportunities even to be able to flex this muscle of speaking and theologizing and doing justice work. And so I'm very excited about that. And so then as far as some of my background, I am a native Missourian. I have lived in Missouri for most of my life, but actually at this point, as far as my adult life goes, I've actually split my adult life almost in half between Missouri, and then I lived in Fredericksburg, Virginia, which is outside of Washington, D.C. I lived there for about 5 or 6 years, and so that was actually a very formative experience for me, because growing up in the Midwest, I come from a rural farm town, and then I went to university in the third largest city in Missouri. It's also a very white city. And so growing up in rural Missouri, where there definitely is a Black community in my hometown, but I was still very much a minority. And in many of the spaces that I traveled within, I was the only Black person. And this was the same place. I have a sister who, she's going to get mad at me for saying how much older she is than me. But I have a sister who's 12 years older than I am. So if you do your math there, then you know how old my sister is. And then, so my sister and I, we both grew up in the same town. And my mom went to high school in the town that I grew up in. And then she went to college and then just stayed and had my sister and I. And so we have all grown up through several generations of my family have grown up in in rural Missouri. And so whenever I came to college in Springfield, Missouri, which is where I live now, it was definitely like coming to the city a little bit, because the town that I'm from is only about 10,000 people, and Springfield is about 150,000 people. And so it was very different, but it was also very familiar and similar, because the racial composition of the city is pretty much the same. And so Springfield, whenever I first moved here, it was 90+% white. 14 years later, it's, I think, at 89% white. So it's slowly becoming
Yeah.
a little bit more diverse. But then I spent about, in 2011, I moved to Fredericksburg, Virginia, and that was a very different experience for me. And so where I lived is so funny, because for Virginia, for the DC Metroplex, Fredericksburg is
Mm-hmm.
actually very not diverse, and everybody that I have that is from there, that I'm friends with, they're like, oh my gosh, it's just so not diverse here. Because compared to Richmond, which is the capital of Virginia, Richmond is actually majority people of color. It's actually, I think, like 51% people of color, and most of that is Black people. And going to Richmond, I actually vacationed in Richmond before we ended up moving there, and that was an experience for me, because literally every other person that I encountered, we stayed in downtown Richmond, we stayed in Richmond City whenever I visited, and literally every person that I'm running into was Black. And I did not know what to do with myself in that type of, because I mean, my family, most of my family is Black. There's several of us who have married white people, but for the most part, I mean, the Black people that I've been around the most have been my family or extended family, or even the Black community where I grew up. But to be someplace where every other person looked like me, I was like, oh my goodness, I didn't know how to act. And then subsequently, like whenever we would visit Richmond, I would just be in awe. But where I lived in Fredericksburg, it was about 20 or 30% diverse. But even that, for me, it was like I could go to Walmart and see all sorts of people, who, not just people who look like me, but people of all different races. In my neighborhood where I lived in Virginia, it was a very mixed neighborhood. There were lots of Black people, there were lots of multiracial people, there were lots of Middle Eastern people, there were East Asian people, there were
Yeah.
Indian people, there were Hispanic people. It was like just in that little area where I lived, there was so much diversity, and that marked me, because in my neighborhood, for the first time in my life, I was living among people who looked like me, and it wasn't just like a street.
Mm-hmm.
I lived whenever I was growing up. I lived part of the time with my grandma. I mean, I lived at the house with my mom, but then my grandma helped raise me, and so there was a street that my grandma lived on that everybody, for the most part, on the street was Black. And so I had that experience. But to be in like this whole neighborhood, this whole entire neighborhood of there's several hundred people just right here in this row of townhouses, and having so many people, that was a very eye-opening experience to me. So then some more about myself is that, I'm married to a white man. And so I've had I've grown up in white culture my whole life, but then I've always been aware of who I am. My mom, instilled very much a sense of identity, as far as my Blackness, as far as my cultural heritage, of being proud of who I am and where I came from. And I'm very thankful to her for that. And so as I have moved in and out of the majority culture, but then marrying into a white family who I love, that has been a hugely just eye-opening experience for me, even because there are things that I didn't realize, that I knew that my culture was different, and I knew that I was different than my peers growing up, but I had no idea things that I realized. I just didn't even realize that I express myself differently whenever I speak to white people. I didn't realize how much, how just little things that are just different. And so being married to a white person has opened me up culturally, to on a whole new level, that it's been able to help me really even craft kind of how I talk about these issues and how I understand some of these issues.
Yeah. And you said something. Yeah, you said something just a moment ago that I want you to talk about. You were experiencing these differences in diversity from place to place. And you said that at one point when you were experiencing a lot of diversity, or maybe it was a lack of diversity, you can clarify, but you used the phrase, I didn't know how to act. That's an interesting phrase to me, because I think a lot of us that are in majority culture, in the white normative culture, we don't think about how to act in different circumstances or in different situations. We just always operate from the assumption that everyone is expected to conform to white normative culture, that this is the normal way to act and behave. So I thought that was a very interesting phrase. You want to unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah. So I think I said that in reference to the first time that I visited Richmond, Virginia. And whenever I say that I didn't know how to act, seeing people where the majority of the people looked like me, I just wanted to run up and hug every single black person because I could look out my window right now and sit on my porch and maybe be able to count on one hand the number of black people that I see in a day. And in most of the situations that I've been in my life, I look around and I can see, so most of the time, in a lot of the spaces I've been in, I am the only one. I am the only black person that's there, or the only person of color that's there. Or there's, a thing that we talk about, like you walk into majority spaces and you see the other person and you sort of make eye contact with them, like, hey, I'm here, like, oh, hey, we out here, whatever. So I got to the point where I couldn't count how many black people there were because they were everywhere. We were everywhere. And so it was I don't know how to even articulate what it's like to be someplace and see people as a minority, to be someplace and see people that look like you, and it's just a normal part of life. So it's not just people who are like serving you that look like you. It's people who, there were people in suits and ties that were going to businesses. We visited the Capitol. There were people at the Capitol. We're walking around town. There's people just going about their life, just doing their thing. And it was Richmond, so they were just doing their thing, and RVA is just a whole like thing unto itself. So they're just living their best life, and I'm sitting here, this country girl from Missouri, like, oh my goodness, like y'all's hair, everybody, oh, you guys look so great. Like, it's just, I don't even know how, I don't even think, I'm trying to unpack it. I don't think I can unpack it. It's just, oh my gosh, everybody looks like me. And then even being in the context of living in Fredericksburg, that was only like 30% diverse, or I think 30% black. It might have been a little bit more whenever you added other races and stuff in there. But to go to Walmart and be like, oh wow, I'm not the only person here, or to be like, or to just, like I said, being in my neighborhood and being around that, and being around people of my culture that I have commonality with outside of my family, and people, oh, I love your hair, or like, who does your hair, like whatever, like that was an experience that I'll never forget. And it's been reverse culture shock moving back to Springfield now and being in a city that's 89% white, and I live in the part of town that's kind of supposed to be diverse, and it's not. And I'm like, where's everybody at? Like, it's reversed.
And you're articulating, I think you're articulating very well something that white people generally don't think about, because we never have that experience. And that goes to this idea that we are a majority culture and we expect everyone to conform to our ways of doing things, whether and this infiltrates the church as well, right? So if we piggyback on what I opened with, talking about Azusa Street Mission and how it was led by an African American preacher, and of course that was light years ahead of its time, but it's light years ahead of its time now, because we do not see a lot of especially in Christianity and in the church, we see diverse communities that worship together on occasion, but rarely do we see a diverse community that is led by a person of color. And so I want you to talk a little bit about this idea that is articulated by white folks a lot, that the idea is that we need to be colorblind, that we don't need to see color. But I would push back against that, because obviously that's the way that God created us. And that's very, very important. As you think about that, I want to remind everyone that's tuning in that this is the first in a series of conversations that we're going to have over the next 2 weeks. You can tune in every Tuesday and Thursday at 4. Feel free to comment below, ask questions, share with someone that can benefit from this conversation. So, Ali, talk a little bit about why the phrase "we need to be a colorblind society" is not really a phrase that we should be all that comfortable with.
So yeah, color blindness bothers me.
Yeah.
A lot.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, it bothers, the idea of being colorblind bothers me a lot. And so I'm trying to think of how I want to tackle this, because there's so much that I could say about it. So to me, what being colorblind, for me as a Black woman, what somebody saying, a white person saying, well, but I'm colorblind, or well, we should be colorblind, or whatever, what that telegraphs to me is that you are uncomfortable with race. And so I think, and I actually want to back up here for a minute, because I think that one of the things that people got from the civil rights movement that actually wasn't what the civil rights movement was about, but I think because of how King talked about it and because of how things were in the era, people have this idea that the goal was to be colorblind whenever it wasn't. And I guess that I'll even go farther to say that a lot of race relations in America, we still have a Jim Crow understanding of racism. And so we try to apply those Jim Crow schemas to current ways that racism manifests, and people are flummoxed because they can't, it doesn't fit into that box. And what I mean by a Jim Crow understanding of racism is that racism back, and I'm saying this based on research, but also based on family members who I've talked to who have this lived experience. Racism back then was about color prejudice. It was about how a person looked, or if they, or even their bloodline. So that we talk about the one drop rule. So if they had a Black relative somewhere, their Blackness tainted their whiteness, and so they weren't white anymore, and so they were Black. So it was based on we see the old signs, the old pictures of signs that say white only and colored only. And so the discrimination in, I think, our minds in the late 20th and now the 21st century, our minds go to the idea of discrimination and racism being, well, we can't segregate by color, or we can't do things by color. And so whenever Dr. King said that he wanted his children to be judged not by the color of their skin, but the content of their character, what a lot of people miss in that is that King wasn't saying he doesn't want his children to be viewed as Black anymore. What he's saying is that wherever you take him in context, and wherever you take the idea of all of this in context, it's that the color of people's skin was attributed to a whole bunch of negative stereotypes. So Blackness was attributed to laziness, which makes no sense because we were slaves and we did all the work for all the white people, but somehow after slavery we became lazy. And so Blackness, people who looked like me, were attributed to we are subhuman, we aren't as intelligent, we aren't as hard of workers, we're low income. And so there were all of these negative things that were attributed to the color of our skin, and it was the color of our skin that caused that. There actually was a diagnosis that scientific racism, that they came up with a thing called negritude, which basically meant that suffering from Black skin, or having Black skin, made you suffer from certain ailments. So the cure for that was to become lighter. And well, I mean, I'm always going to be a Negro, so it doesn't matter. So I can never get rid of this disease of negritude, because that's not how it works. And so going back to King, so you put King in context, saying the color, not being judged by the color of your skin, that is a statement that was understood at the time, at least by, I would say was understood by the people of color at the time, and I think perhaps even some white people at the time, not to be don't see color, but to be let's not attribute these negative aspects, these negative attributes to the color of the skin. But unfortunately, and I think that, and I hate to criticize the civil rights movement, especially on Juneteenth, not that the two really have very much to do with one another, but I think that that was one of the major shortcomings of the civil rights movement, because the focus was on segregation and on the Jim Crow laws. And so the Jim Crow laws were put in terms of color. And so people think, well, so now white people have this perception that, well, if I see color, that means that I'm discriminating. If I see color, that means if I call attention to a person's color, that's wrong. That's discrimination. And that's actually not what it is. It's not calling attention to a person being different. I mean, if you look at the screen right now, we are different. We look different. I have a different culture. I come from a different background. Even my husband and I, something that I didn't mention, we lived in the same town for the same amount of time. We grew up, we are the same age. We are the same grade. We were the same grade in high school. We grew up. He did go to a different elementary and middle school than I did because his family was farmers, so they lived on the farm. But we went to the same high school. We had a lot of the same formative experiences, knew the same people. So I think that that's a good test case for we grew up in the same stuff, yet we are so different, and our family cultures are so different. But we grew up, we're the same age, we're married, we have some commonality, but there's so much difference there. And so going once again back to the colorblind thing, I think that's something that because of how Jim Crow was set up, white people got the memo. Okay, well, we're not supposed to discriminate based on color, and that was great. But then what they thought, what I think has happened is that, well, I'm not discriminating based on color means not seeing color. And I also attribute that too, as people have become more aware of their prejudice in families that had lived through this period and realized, oh, well, we can't discriminate. There's certain things that we can't say. There was this heritage that was passed down, I believe, in the white community. I don't know because I'm not white, but just in different people that I've talked to, the idea was because it was all color of the skin. Well, don't talk about the color of the skin, and then that somehow erases racism, and that erases prejudice, and that erases all that. So going back
and what that misses the idea that yes, we have moved beyond discriminating based upon the color of the skin, but all of that discrimination is still present in our institutions.
Yes.
It has become institutionalized, and it is also still present in our culture.
Yes.
Because by nature of your statement, I didn't know how to act. White people don't
ever have to think about it.
How to act, right?
I think that with colorblindness, then what bothers me about colorblindness is that it ultimately centers the feelings of the person who's colorblind, because they don't want to feel like they're being racist by seeing color, and that's not what's at issue. So that's one thing. The other thing about being colorblind that bothers me is that it's saying that everybody's the same and that everybody is homogenous. Whenever I have differences, and I'm not saying that because I want to be different, but it's just the truth. My hair looks different than Taylor Swift's hair. There's a whole way that I take care of my hair and skin that she doesn't do. And so that is part of my culture, and that's become part of my culture even because of the racism that we've experienced. How we raise, how we do our hair, how we take care of our skin, all that type of stuff. That even it was born out of that oppression, and some of it was also stuff that we brought over here from Africa with us. So to say that you don't see the color of my skin erases that. And it erases to say that you don't see to say that you don't see the color of my skin is saying that you don't see who I am. as a person. And that's something that's very hard for white people to understand, I think, because you don't necessarily racialize yourself as white. You don't necessarily, you have a racialized identity. Whenever other people bring up their racialized identity, then it's like, oh yes, I'm a white person. But I don't think that white people just necessarily just walk around just thinking, oh hey, I'm white. And like, oh hey, white culture, oh hey, white whatever. I could be wrong. I'm not white, but just what I've observed from
No, I
white
think
culture
you're exactly right.
over these last 33 years, what I have observed of white culture, that's not a thing. And so I think that for white people, it's very easy to say, well, but oh, the color of the skin, that's so petty, that's so trivial, that's so whatever. Where for me, I'm like, but the color of my skin like determines a lot. How I move in the world, how people perceive me. I cannot change being a Black woman at all. I am always, because I'm always going to present as Black. There are some Black people who are lighter skinned, who are mixed race or whatever, that they are able to sometimes kind of go in and out of cultures, and a lot of them even don't want to. Like they've said, you know, this is who I am, and I don't want to have to try to be more Black or more white. I just want to be me. But there are some people that can have a luxury of sort of being able to pretend like, okay, yeah, I'm not this or that. But in most of my life situations, I have no choice but to be Black. And so like if I'm on the phone with somebody, I can speak in a way that people think that I'm white. And I've had that whenever I was growing up. I would, you know, because this was back before texting. I'm still old enough. I remember texting. Texting came out whenever I was in high school, but I'm old enough to where you called your friends on the phone, and you picked up the phone and you dialed the number and you called your friends and you talked to them on the phone. And whenever I would do that, I would, you know, ask like, you know, hey, is so-and-so there, so-and-so there? And invariably the families would always think that I was a white girl. And then they'd see me, I'd meet them at a school function, or they'd invite me to spend the night or something like that. And there would always be like kind of a surprise, like, hold up, she's Black. And not necessarily, I never experienced that like in a way that I ever construed as negative, but because it was always funny to me. It was always a joke. It was always a joke to see like who knew which family members knew that I was Black and not a white girl whenever I'm calling their house. And so anyway.
what you're describing, we're going to talk about in future broadcasts. And by the way, for those of you, I know people are tuning in and out, so I want to remind everyone that this is the first in a series of broadcasts that we're going to do every Tuesday and Thursday for the next 3 weeks at 4 p.m. Central Standard Time. So we're going to spend about an hour talking on these issues. And what you mentioned there, again, trigger warning, right, for everybody, is the idea of white privilege. You do not have the choice not to think of yourself as not being Black. But I get to walk around in the world and I never have to reflect on my whiteness, because I see it reflected in the normative culture. If entertainment, advertising, everything in America is catered to white people, and then we expect Black people to Black and brown people to assimilate and to become more like us. And I think what you're speaking to is this idea that we've got to move beyond a simplistic understanding of race, especially, and I think I always consider as a Christian, I have a greater burden to bear in modeling that for the culture. So I want you to talk a little bit about when did you become aware, because you have moved in this culture and you have ministered in this culture. When did you become aware that there was a need to move beyond this simplistic understanding of race, especially in church context?
July 2nd, 1985.
Wow, that's pretty specific.
That's my birthday. No.
Okay.
that's the day I was born. But no, really.
You became aware very early on then.
Yes, I became very aware very early on. But I was just joking there. Yeah. But I became Whew, that's happened even in layers. As I said, I grew up in a predominantly white town, and so I was very aware of racial issues. Like, I can't remember a time whenever I wasn't actually. Like, I've thought about this many times, and I've tried to think of a time when I wasn't aware that I wasn't Black, when I wasn't aware of any of that, and I honestly I can't think of it. I can't, because at my grandma's house, at home with my family, we were in the Black community, at our church, at our community events. It was one way, and then moving everywhere else in the world, it was different. And so things were just different. People spoke differently, people had different values, people listened to different music. It was just there. So I was always aware of the differences. And so whenever it came to seeing, like, we have to move away from simplistic understanding, I guess that in some ways, and I think it's just part of being youth, of being a teen, of being a child, I guess that I thought that everybody that I was growing up with heard the same things that I heard in the same ways that I heard them. And what I mean by that is, we talked about the civil rights movement in school. We talked about slavery in school. We talked about all these different things in school. And I just always sort of lived with the assumption that, like, white people got that there was still racism today. I mean, I remember the Rodney King beating. I have memory of the Los Angeles riots. I have memory of the O.J. Simpson trial and kind of what a divide that was along race. I have memory of all of these things. And so I just assumed that my peers did also. And as I have progressed through life, it's been in layers, but this most recent layer has been really with Ferguson, with seeing my brothers and sisters in Christ. I lived in Virginia at the time, and so, like I said, I'm native Missourian, so I have friends all over Missouri. Have friends who lived in St. Louis whenever that was going on, and seeing how people responded to that was like, it was heartbreaking, because I had thought, just because of my existence, I had sort of thought that we were a little bit farther along perhaps than what we were, but people just showed their entire selves during Ferguson, and it was like disgusting, and that made me ill. But I say that, but I was aware of it before then. And in the church, trying to decide what I want to say, how I'm trying to craft my words and say my words very well. I was very aware of it in the church. I mean, once again, from a young age, because I went to predominantly Black churches my whole entire life, and there were times, and especially in a few of the church, well, no, every church I attended actually as a kid, where there would be a few white people that would attend, or that were just part of the church or whatever, but it was still a predominantly Black thing, and I knew that was like my culture, and that was different, and that white church was different, even though I had never been to a white church before. Really, I knew that it was different. I just knew that it was different because you see stuff on TV, and you talk to your friends, and you know that, like, they're not getting happy in church. I mean, unless they're Pentecostal, but I didn't know any Pentecostals back then. And even Pentecostals get happy. White Pentecostals do things a little bit differently than Black Pentecostals. Right. But so I knew that there were differences. I knew that there was segregation and stuff in the church. But for me, coming to Springfield, Missouri, as a young engaged woman, and I knew my mom had told me, had sat my then fiance and I down before we came to Springfield, and she was just like, "Look, let me tell you all about Springfield. They're racist down there." And she went through some different things of people that she knew, some experiences that they had down there. And she even said later, she was like, she kind of had a problem with me coming to school down here, in part because some of it because of just the road used to be so bad, driving between my hometown and Springfield, but also just because of the reputation that Springfield had culturally. And so something that she said, she was just like, "Look, there's a lot of racism down there. You guys need to be careful. You guys people might not accept you, because you're a mixed race couple. And so, I mean, I was, 19 at the time, and I'm thinking, like, I just turned 19, and I'm thinking, okay, Mom, like, really, it's okay. Like, Springfield's the city. It's the city. This isn't Clinton. This is the city. It's whatever. And I'm just thinking, like, okay, this is the city. Certainly people aren't narrow-minded, whatever. And this, like, it's going to be all right. And we get down here and we start visiting churches, and we walk in and people just staring at us, like, just like uncomfortably staring at us, friendly, but staring. And a lot of this happens less now than it did 14 years ago. But people we would be places, people would stare at us. We'd go out to eat, and like people wouldn't charge our tickets to the same. Even after we told them that we were together, they wouldn't charge our tickets on the same tickets. And so I realized that it was just a very different experience. And so I became very acutely aware of it in the church. And there's stories that I could tell that I won't go into. But I became aware of it in the church as I became a leader and ascended the ranks of leadership in different congregations, and how people responded to that. And some people didn't respond well to it. And some people that were okay with me being a leader, but they didn't respond well to my leadership. And that's a whole other thing. But anyway,
yeah. And that makes a lot of sense, because I think sometimes when it's good to have these conversations, because we assume things about the culture that may or may not be true. And especially coming from a white perspective and a white background, again, we do not have to think about these issues. We do not have to think through these issues. And we're going to deal with this in more in depth later on. But this is by definition white privilege. And lots of people have problems with that phrase, because they think that we're saying, well, you didn't have to work for what you have in life, that you didn't grow up in poverty. No, that's not what we're saying at all. What we are saying is that when you are white, you are afforded certain opportunities in life that you're not even aware of. And one of those is that you have the ability not to think about race. You don't have to deal with issues that Black and brown people have to deal with on a daily basis. And that is the definition of white privilege. But more on that the next time we get together. Let's stay with churches here for just a moment. What do you wish that your white brothers and sisters understood about being Black in America, and about being Black in the church, in a white normative society?
Ooh, so I guess that one of the things that I wish that people knew, that I wish that white people knew, is that being racially conscious isn't a sin. It's not an issue. It's not something that doesn't need to be talked about. It's not a phase. It's not a soapbox. It's not anything other than me being and people of color being who they are, and wanting to have the same, wanting to be equal, and wanting to have the same access, the same benefits, be viewed the same way as everyone else in our culture. And that,
well, let me play devil's advocate right now and say, well, Allie, you are equal. What do you not have that all of us white folks have?
That is a very good question, because we're equal in that, like, I can go to the same store and not have to go in the back entrance. If I need to go to the restroom in public, I can pee in the same toilet. I can drink out of the same water fountain. I can do a lot of things ostensibly that everyone else can do. But that goes back to the Jim Crow understanding of racism. That racism is more than just not being able to do things. Racism is also how people treat you. It's how people
Yes.
talk about you. It's how people interact with your body in space. It's how people perceive you in space. And so what I have what I don't have that I see my white brothers and sisters that they have, especially in the church, is that they often have a voice that I don't have. So even people who are, so if I'm outspoken about race, about things, it happens all the time. that somebody will trot into my mentions, somebody will trot into my comments, somebody will trot into my inbox. The inbox is actually the worst at times, where there is an assumption where the burden of proof on me, the burden of proof is on me to prove that there's something wrong. And so I don't have, so the thing is so I guess that I can synthesize this. I can boil this down to some terms, and hopefully I don't have to define them. But I lack the ability to, in white people's eyes and in society, I don't have the ability to name my own experiences without white approval. So if something racist happens to me and I point to that and I say like today at the movie theater, this has actually happened today. I was walking around with my 17-month-old at the movie theater because we tried to see The Incredibles and she showed out and it was a thing. And there was and I was she was walking around and she was sort of by herself, but I was following her, and somebody sort of kind of came up to her and they just stood there and stared at us and sort of like it was uncomfortable. it was kind of uncomfortable because just the way that she started to interact with my youngest, it was almost like she was I don't know, she thought like didn't know if I was the babysitter, didn't know if I was if I was this kid's mommy or what. But because I've done this before in situations that I felt like were sketchy, where you sort of insert yourself into the situation and kind of stand there to make sure. I've done that before. I've done that before, like with people that looked like they were sketchy with children, and so anyway. What was I going to say? Sorry, I got I got this big notification come up on my screen for some odd reason. So anyway, so
you were talking about how you felt.
So to me, like that felt like, and I'm not going to say, oh, that was racist, that was whatever, but that was a situation that made me very uncomfortable because it seemed like that woman did not readily recognize my mixed race child as being mine. And so was putting herself into the situation to kind of monitor, to kind of see what was happening. And I guess to see that I wasn't kidnapping my child or something like that. Like just that was how that situation felt to me. And so there are a lot of white people that if I said that to my friends who have mixed kids, or I mean, heck, if I said that to any like black person virtually, they would be like, oh dang, that's horrible. But often, like if I were to say this, if I were to post about this on my Facebook page, there would be white people that would make all sorts of excuses for that.
Right.
And so not having the agency to be able to name my own experiences and say, this is what I experienced, and what I experienced was racist, without having to prove to people that it was racist, rather than just being believed. Just being believed, especially by people that know me. Just that I'm not going to just be like, that was racism, that was racism, that was racism. Like, you know, like they had white tires on their car instead of black. That's racist. To know that I would know what racism is, that I would know well enough after having experienced it in my life, that I would know if something was off, what that was. And so that's one thing. And then self-determination, to be able to determine for myself, my life, my destiny, where I'm going to be, and how I'm going to fit professionally, or how I'm going to fit into an organization, or however that is. Often as a black person, I lack I go into situations and lack self-determination, because there oftentimes will be people telling me what I should do, or what I should be, or how. And so that goes along with being able to name my experiences, being able to determine for myself, this is how my life is, or this is how things are. So that's just, I mean, like that's like surface level of stuff that you say, whenever you ask, well, what do you have? What don't you have that everybody else has? And those are two very kind of, I mean, crucial things, I think, to be able to name your experience, to be able to say this happened. That's a pretty big thing, to be able to do that, and to not have to be able to say this happened, and for people to empathize with you, for people to agree or to whatever, without having to try to justify and prove your
and what a powerful gift that is, to give to another human being, instead of listening to your experience and then making excuses and say, no, you didn't see that right, you misunderstood it. What an incredible gift it is to simply say, wow, I'm so sorry that happened to you.
Right.
And to empathize and yeah, it says a lot about us, I believe, as a white majority culture, that we simply cannot listen to other people and believe what they are telling us.
Yeah, and I guess I'll say something else on that too. So with the thing that's going on at my school, we've started a hashtag Toxic Fuller, hashtag Seminary While Black, hashtag Black Exodus, and so that's on Twitter and on Facebook. And I actually wrote an article for a blog that's called The Witness. It's a Black Christian collective. They pick up stories like this. It's geared mostly, that the audience is Black Christians, but then there's a lot of white allies that listen to the different podcasts and that read the blog and everything. And so I actually am a regular contributor for them. And so whenever this was going on, I was like, hey, this is happening. Can I write about this? Will you pick this article up? And they were like, yes, of course. And so I wrote this article, talked about what happened, and then I've actually not read the comments. I think beyond the first day, I read a couple of the comments, and people
don't ever read the comments.
I don't ever read the comments. I just, like, somebody had said something, so I was like, oh, they had referenced something. So I was like, oh, let me go see. Nope, don't want to see. Don't want to see that. Don't want to be in that anymore. But on this article, but then also in the hashtag, people at mentioning me and stuff on Twitter, I've had the experience where people are like, well, but can you tell me, like, what exactly has happened? Like, why is this? And in the article, and in a lot of the things that we have put out with this, we have said Fuller is toxic because of this, that, and the other. This is not, like, it's toxic because we're losing Black faculty. We don't have enough Black faculty. There's not Black thought in the institution. So we've lined some of these things out, not like super specifically, like, on this day this professor did this, even though there are stories like that. We didn't line it out line by line. And so just saying it in a generality like that, there have been people who haven't believed us, who have been like, well, that's not specific enough. We need to, I need to know exactly. And it's like, okay, there's actually, I normally don't blast what happens on my inbox, but there's a friend, an old friend who came into my inbox and was questioning me about some things, and was questioning me about some things. And so finally, I just had to tell them. I was like, I hear what you're saying, and I hear some of your objections to what you're saying, but you're going to have to trust me to be able to name my own experiences, and to be able to be able to have the self-determination to say this is the solution to the problem, because I'm at this institution and you're not. Like, I'm here in this existence, and we're not suffering from mass Black hysteria on Fuller campus. There are common experiences. We have documents going back to the 80s saying the same thing that we're saying. And so it's not all in our heads, like we're just making it up. So being able to self-determine and say, this is what, and I understand, and I want to play devil's advocate on myself, that I understand that sometimes people come in and they express, well, but it could be this and it could be that, because they think that they're helping, because they want to try to help you see a different perspective or whatever. And I get that. I've done that whenever people have experienced things, and it's sort of like, well, maybe there could be like maybe, because I do that myself. I'm like, maybe there could be another explanation for this thing whenever it's clearly something else. Maybe there's another explanation. And so I totally understand the desire to do that. But what it ends up happening, what ends up being the unintended consequences, the impact. You talk about intent versus impact. Your intent might be to help that person not feel bad about themselves, but the impact actually is it's communicating, well, I don't actually believe you, and don't believe that your experiences are valid, and it takes on another life of its own whenever it's a race issue, because so much happens on the level of we're questioning, like, it was this racist. So for me, I've said it a million times, for me to even come out and say I feel like this is racist, there's so much. We're not just saying, oh, that's because, I mean, like, I'd be walking around like just pointing at stuff like that's racist. I mean, we would be in a constant state of just like flipping out, because there's a lot of stuff that's racist. And so for a person of color to actually stand up and say, okay, this was some racist stuff right here.
Yeah.
Because we encounter it every single day. And yes, there are things that we're picking at now because we've gotten some of the bigger atrocities out of the way. I mean, like, people say, oh, well, people are so sensitive nowadays, blah, 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 blah. You're back then, blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, you know, my ancestors were fighting for the right to pee in the same toilet in public. Like, that's like, so the racist magazine covers and the racist makeup aisle and other racist things, those weren't on their radar because they were fighting for like basic human dignity, like just the basic dignity to be able to walk into a restaurant and sit down and eat. Like that, like my ancestors fought that battle, and so I don't have to fight that battle. But also, it doesn't mean that the things that have been going on, just because people haven't been aware of it, because white people haven't been aware of it for so long. These things we've always talked about. These are things that Black people have always talked about. Not being able to get makeup, not being able to buy pantyhose, all these things. We've always talked about that. And so we're saying more because it's go ahead.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that there aren't battles still to fight. And I think that's a huge takeaway, and we're almost out of time. So I think that's a huge takeaway today, that first of all, if you are a white person, do a inventory of sorts and examine how white your world is. Are there people of color that you have given liberty, that you should give liberty to? And think about that phrase for just a moment, that, you know, we live in such a normative white culture that, you know, I have to say to your friends of color, see how many you have, first of all, and then do you give them the liberty to speak into your life and to own their experiences without you pushing back and saying, oh, you know, that's something that's not important, that's not real, it's all in your head. So we engage in this gaslighting, right? This idea that, oh, you must be crazy, you're imagining this, look how far we've come. And, you know, we've all embraced Dr. King's dream, so that really doesn't exist. So do an inventory in your life, see how white your world is, and then, you know, take some steps to diversify your world, and then allow people to speak into that world in a honest and truthful way. And we've kind of entitled this Listen and Learn, because that's what we want to model for all of our friends and family on Facebook, that there is a way to listen and learn and not become defensive to the point that you put up these walls and you put up these barriers and you refuse to listen. So in just the few minutes that we've got left, Allie, I know there's some things that we didn't get to. We will get to on Thursday. So I want to invite everyone to tune in on Thursday at 4 p.m. As well. Put questions below, comments below. The good thing about this is that it will remain up and you can watch later. Share it with your friends, share it with your family. This is a very, very important conversation. How would you respond to people who say, well, you know, as Christians, we need to focus on the gospel. It's just the gospel of Jesus Christ, and all of these social issues will work themselves out. I would push back against that, and I would say immediately, well, this is a gospel issue, because gospel issue is all of our lives and not just our eternal destiny. So take the last 5 minutes or so and talk about why you believe that both of us believe this is a gospel issue.
Yeah, I'm going to do that, but actually I'm going to go back to something that you said,
Sure.
Scott, and I like what you said about diversifying your world, about having people of color who can speak into your life. Something else that I want to say is that proximity doesn't mean crap. And I'm
Yes.
sorry for the strong
Right.
language there, but proximity does not mean anything. You
Right.
can be proximate to, you can be next to people of color in your life and still be racist, still be
Absolutely.
prejudiced, still
Yeah.
have severe blind spots.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that yes, you definitely need to that white people, you definitely need to diversify who you're hanging out with, what wells you're drinking from, as in terms of like if you're a Christian, as far as who you're listening to sermons from different from leaders that are diverse, reading books from leaders that of leaders who are diverse, and all of that is great. But at the end of the day, especially in your personal relationships, people have to feel safe with you. And so they have to feel and racially safe with you. Because there are people that I feel safe with, like kind of in a general sense, in a general sense, I know that they're not going to mistreat me. In a general sense, I know that they're going to be kind to my children. In a general sense, they're good people, they're stand-up people, et cetera, et cetera. But I do not feel necessarily like racially safe with them. And so in sharing certain experiences and stuff, I'm not going to share certain experiences with them because they don't get it, and it takes much more labor to be able to talk about it and to be able to whatever, and it not being a push pull. So I don't share the things that have happened or that I experienced, because I know that it's not okay. But then I have white friends who I can go to and say, yeah, this happened today, and this bothers me that this happened, and I know that they will sit with me in my pain. I know that they will sit with me in my grief, and that it'll be okay, and that they're a safe person to talk, and they're a safe person to talk to, and be like, okay, you know what, there's this thing about white culture that I'm not understanding, and so I've had this encounter, and I don't know how to talk about this, or are you seeing the same thing that I'm seeing here? And that's very reassuring. So I want to add that you have to be a safe person. And the way that I carry myself is different in different situations. And I've shared this before, but like with my husband being white, I realized that I was carrying myself differently around him. And so after we got married, because we were a couple for I think almost 3 years before we got married, and so once we got married, it was like you're with that person all the time. Like you go to bed at that person's in the same house as that person, if not the same bed as that person. And so I realized, like, man, I can't get comfortable. What's going on? And then I realized that one, like I didn't feel like I could fully express myself, because there's a way that I speak, there's slang that I use, there's whatever, that I realized, like, he doesn't, like, I just always been like, oh, Ben doesn't know what that is. And so it's been whatever. That then after we got married, it's like, okay, I can't express myself. And like, I'm really trying to communicate here and I can't. And then it's like, man, I can't relax. And I realized I was carrying myself differently. And it wasn't because of anything that he did necessarily. I mean, other than be white, there wasn't anything that he did, and that he wasn't doing anything wrong.
Right.
But I realized that I had to be able to kind of let my hair down figuratively at another level that I couldn't with him. And so taking that into the issue of it being of just the focus on the gospel, because race is a different issue, it's a social issue, and it doesn't have any place in the church, or whatever tropes that have been said about that. I think that it very much is a gospel issue. I mean, first of all, at the most basic level, it's love thy neighbor. It's love your neighbor as yourself. And so loving your neighbor doesn't just mean like, oh, I like that person and I'm not racist. That's not loving your neighbor. Loving your neighbor as yourself is allowing them to name their experiences, is allowing them to have, and I say allowing them, that's probably the wrong word to use, especially in talking in black-white dynamics, but it is giving them space to self-determine without feeling like they need your approval as a white person.
Well said.
Yes. But it is feeling like being able to name their experiences without being a white without needing white approval. It's being able to dress and speak in the way that they feel like they need to speak or dress in whatever given situation, without it being without it being a thing. So like some Black women styles their hair differently. People lose their stuff like at the workplace. That like loving your neighbor is complimenting, is being nice, but loving them in a racial way that gives honor to their culture and makes room for their culture. So like whenever you greeted me, whenever we came on this podcast, you said Happy Juneteenth. You're aware that today in my culture, that to me that this might be a special day, and that can be kind of awkward if somebody doesn't know that it's Juneteenth. Hey, Happy Juneteenth, and they're like, Happy what? And that can be kind of awkward. And like you don't have to be like Happy Kwanzaa. You don't have to be like that. It doesn't have to be like that all the time. Sure. But still acknowledging that hey, you have something that is different. Like one of the coolest things was going to Black Panther and seeing people, seeing white people, because I mean it was mostly white people at that movie theater. And I was dressed up similarly to this, but I was full Wakanda and I had face makeup and everything. And people like stopping and people being like, yeah, and they weren't dressed. They were white. They weren't dressed. They knew better than to dress up like that for Black Panther. But they were like, yes, do that. That's awesome. Oh, I'm so glad you did that. That type of thing is loving your neighbor.
Celebratory.
It's being celebratory rather than so like it's so I mean you're loving your neighbor isn't telling your Black friend you talk white. Like that's not loving your neighbor. It's not making racial stereotype jokes and asking them why they don't fit into certain stereotypes and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is loving your neighbor. And so that's just the basic level that is a gospel issue. But it's a gospel issue too, because God made us all the way that he made us. He created us all. He fashioned us all, and we're different. And we have different cultures and we have different things. And so we are not complete as a body of Christ in our understanding, in our revelation of Christ, if everyone isn't there. And so racism has been a stumbling block in the Black community to Black people receiving the gospel, in the same way that it's been a stumbling block for Jewish people, in the same way that it's been a stumbling block for Native Americans and other groups who've been persecuted. It is a stumbling block because we have this history, and because Black people, we view ourselves often in history. We don't just live now. We don't just we live. We have just and this is a whole other broadcast. Even talk about that, of how we orient ourselves in time and space. So for us, slavery is over. Like I realize that I'm not a slave, but I still carry a measure of that within me.
Yes.
I have living memory in my family of Jim Crow. I have living memory. This is my older aunts and uncles. This was my grandparents. This was my mom. My mom was a kid during the Civil Rights Movement. So this is living memory for me. I have the stories. I mean, even within 2 or 3 generations of my family, we can tell the same types of stories, going to the same high school, telling the same stories of things that happened to us, and it was all 20 and 30 years apart that this is happening. And so these experiences, these negative experiences, are a stumbling block then to people being able to hear the gospel, because they don't see to Black people hearing the gospel, particularly in Black men. And so it's a stumbling block.
So someone proclaiming the gospel to a person of color and saying, well, yes, there were problems in the past, but you need to get over it. We've moved beyond that. That's the past. That person is not going to be open to receiving anything that you have to share.
Well, yeah, because it's like, that's the past. Well, that was my grandma that lived.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not the past. That's not the past to me. Culturally, that's not the past to me. That was people that it was people even in my family that I didn't know, but that's not the past to me. And so it creates a stumble. So to me, anything that keeps the gospel from going forth, that's hindering. That's hindering the gospel. And so it's a gospel issue whenever you have a community of people who, even though yes, the Black community has held on to the Christian religion, but there are people that are rejecting, and I've seen friends, I've seen family members, I've seen different people reject Christianity and reject the gospel because of how white Christians have behaved in the past and how they continue to behave. And
Yeah.
so that is so that's keeping people. There are people, Nation of Islam during the civil rights movement, they're still there. They're still going. That has been especially detrimental because the Christianity that we have isn't giving them a sense of power and a sense of dignity and a sense of worth. But there are these other alternative religions that are giving Black people a sense of power and dignity and worth, and they don't want to be associated with oppression. And there's not been the amends, an adequate, I think, amount of amends made in Christianity for that oppression. And so all of that to say that it is a gospel issue. And so it's not just a social thing. It's not just who's running for the school board. It is something that affects people's existence, and if it affects their existence, it is part of. It's something that's dear to Jesus' heart, and it's something that he cares about. And if it's something that's preventing people from coming to him, and I mean, Jesus said this about children, but it affects children, but it's like, you keep a child from coming to the Lord, you might as well have a millstone tied around your neck. Well, it's vicarious, it's whatever, but effectively you're doing that, and whoa,
yes.
whoa,
Absolutely.
woe to you.
Well anyway. Said. Yeah, exactly. Allie, sadly, we're out of time, and we're going to do this again this coming Thursday, and we're going to be talking about white privilege. We're going to be going a little bit more into depth into white normative culture and what that means for a person of color. But I think you're exactly right. This is a gospel issue, and this is why we are having this series of Listen and Learn, because we want to be a good example to our friends and family, but also we want people to think seriously through these issues, because they do have powerful gospel ramifications. And so thank you so much for being so open and honest and sharing your heart with all of us. And I'll encourage all of our folks that have tuned in for some or all of this, please comment, please share. And please join us again this coming Thursday at 4 p.m. For another edition of Listen and Learn. Thank you so much, Allie, and I'll see you on Thursday.
Yeah. See you then.
Bye-bye.
Bye.